Welcome back. Today we're going to look at the significant change in the American economy from 1850, at the end of the War of 1812 with Britain, until 1850, just a few years before the Civil War. You'll recall that before and during the War of 1812, the United States had imposed a number of trade embargoes, and the economic impact of this was it really forced Americans to develop their own small scale factories and particularly textile mills to produce the products and the clothing and cloth that had previously been imported largely from Britain. Also, we're going to see during this period, the United States becomes more and more of a transcontinental country. After the war with Mexico, which ended in 1848, which we'll see in another lecture, the United States boundaries extended out into the Pacific Ocean. So during the mid-19th century, the United States has a lot of land, a lot of very fertile land, good for farming, and it's cheap, much, much cheaper than land in Europe. And there were many jobs, both in agriculture and in the new factory. These two forces attracted many, many millions of hardworking immigrants. And as we'll see later in the lecture, most of these immigrants came from the northern part of Western Europe. The Midwest, which is generally the area around the the Great Lakes and a little south of it, this was characterized by large-scale commercial agriculture. By commercial agriculture, we mean agriculture that is undertaken to sell the products to a third party or in the marketplace. And this is opposed to subsistence agriculture, which we saw before, which is when a farmer produces just enough food to eat and perhaps a little more to sell to buy goods that the farmer cannot produce on the farm, things like sugar and coffee and whatnot. Over this period, we're also going to see cotton become the major crop in the United States, and cotton production takes place in the South, and it's known as King Cotton. And cotton became the first product of industrial capitalism. Now you might ask how this was possible. Well, the cotton was transformed in textile mills into cloth and various clothing, bed sheets, and whatnot. And this became a major product. So cotton basically drove what's known as the first industrial revolution, is what we're talking about today. In the next course, you will study the second industrial revolution, which took place after the Civil War. Now, the northeastern part of the United States led in industrial development with small factories and textile mills. And as we'll see, the textile mills were located there largely because the northeastern part of the United States has many fast rivers, and the fast rivers were used to turn wheels which produced the energy for the textile mills. And as a result, at the end of this period, 1850, you can think of 1860, basically when the Civil War was about to start, the U.S. had the fastest growing, not the largest yet, but the fastest growing economy in the world in terms of commerce, manufacturing, agricultural exports, agricultural production, and mining. Now, obviously, these significant changes in the economic system had profound changes in politics, the legal system of the country, which was changed significantly to accommodate these developments, as well as in society. The economy in the United States was characterized by markets, and therefore it's called a market-based economy. By markets, we mean there was an exchange of products using cash. This is not a barter economy. People are not exchanging general, one good for another. And the production, both in factories and largely in agriculture, was done to sell the products in the market. So both in ag have crops as well as livestock being raised in distant markets. The farmers still raised pigs, which they consumed, but they raised many more pigs than they planned to consume, or chickens or whatnot, because their goal was exchange in the marketplace, and then they would use the money they received to buy other products. We're also going to be beginning to see a lot more periodic economic recessions in the United States because of failures in the market system. But I think it's important that we look long term. And if you look at the economic activity, and particularly per capita income, adjusted for inflation, you can see over time there's a significant upward trend. So here we are in 1860 on the eve of the Civil War. You can see that the area colored purple has expanded out south of the Great Lakes, and this is due to both industrialization in cities and much more intensive commercial agriculture. The population of the entire United States is shifted westward. You can see the Midwest here is heavily populated, as is the South. And in the South particularly, we'll see in a few minutes that much of that population increase is accounted for by slaves growing cotton. But in the North, we have the greatest concentration of population. This map shows the major industrial areas in the United States. The dark green are such areas, and you can see they're centered in New England, the southern part of New England, largely along rivers with fast streams. And then you can see the New York, Philadelphia area going down to Baltimore and through Pennsylvania. So now the economy is picking up. There are many people who want to get involved in commerce, and it's quickly realized that there's a need for internal improvements in the infrastructure, what we call now the infrastructure in the United States. They needed deeper harbors, because they needed deeper harbors to accommodate the large ships that were crossing the Atlantic. They needed lighthouses to provide navigation. And they also, people generally agreed there was a need for a network of roads, canals, bridges, and later railroads to transport these products. The emphasis here is not on passenger trains or roads for passengers, but rather means of transportation for the products. And the major question was, who is going to pay for this? Will private citizens pay? Will private companies pay? Or will the federal government pay? To use the example of a lighthouse is what you've probably studied in economics is called a public good. A lighthouse is put up to indicate to ships at a distance the entrance to a harbor, or to warn ships away from a rocky area near the coast. Well, if private citizens pay for that lighthouse, the problem is everybody can use the lighthouse. I mean, if a ship comes in and the ship company has not paid for the lighthouse, or it comes from a country that has not paid, they still benefit from the lighthouse. Therefore, a decision was made early on to have the public have lighthouses largely financed by the federal government. It's not exactly the same situation, of course, for a road, because it's relatively easy to control who goes on a road and who doesn't. And of course, in the United States today, most roads are public, but we have a number of roads that were built by the private sector through detailed agreements with the government, and which tolls are charged. I mean, just here in Houston, we have Highway 8, the Sam Houston Tollway, in which, as you well know, you pay a toll to use. And that is done because the government entities, whether it's the county or the city or the state, simply did not have the funds to build the road, so they allow a private company to build the road, and it's a very detailed contract. The private company can only increase the tolls when they can demonstrate to the satisfaction of the governments that they need to do so because of increased maintenance costs or whatnot. And then also, after a certain number of years, those roads become property of the government. So, it depends on the road and how much was invested. So this is a map showing the roads around 1840. The roads and canals. First of all, the roads are in red, and these are the large national roads. The main one to focus on is the so-called National Road, which runs right through the middle of the states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And that road is used extensively by farmers to take crops to the East Coast cities. We'll go to a place like Baltimore, and then the crops would either travel by road or ship to the other cities or to Europe. This map also shows in green some of the major early canals, which we'll talk about extensively later. These were dug by hand, extensive system of canals. And then this map does not show railroads because while railroads started in the late 1830s, by the 1840s, they were not a significant factor. Here we see a drawing of a stagecoach on an early road. You can just imagine how bumpy that road was. And you can see in the center of the stagecoach the man who's desperately reaching out to grab his hat, which was blown off of him by the wind and the bumpy ride. And the poor lady in the very back is desperately holding on to her baby. Obviously, she doesn't want her baby thrown out of the carriage. So the roads were very primitive. This road is shown this in fine weather, but the roads were often impassable after heavy rains. They were just deep mud. Now, the Cumberland Road was the first federal funding of a road between two states, because people generally agreed, while they wanted a liberal government, that it would be appropriate for the government to fund the construction of this expensive road. And we'll see the road here on the next slide. So what we have in green is the National Road. That was built with private funds, so anyone who went on that road had to periodically pay a toll. The part in green, however, was built by the federal government, and it crosses a very mountainous area. So the green road is over a more or less flat area, and it was much more expensive to build a road through the mountains. And it goes, you can see, from Wheeling over to Cumberland, Maryland, and there it connects with the canal, which we'll see a little later, the canal which takes products down to Washington, D.C., and if the products aren't consumed, purchased in Washington, D.C., they are then shipped on a boat or another road elsewhere. Now, it was then and still is least expensive to transport heavy products such as agricultural products, wheat, corn, whatnot, or coal. It's much cheaper to transport that by water, by ship, than by road. Well, the problem is there were not rivers oftentimes going in the directions that people wanted to ship their products. While you have the Mississippi River going north-south, there are very, very few people living in that area at the time. The Ohio River, as we saw, flows sort of southwest to the Mississippi and then down to New Orleans. But there was a real need to build artificial rivers or canals. And around 3,000 miles of canals were dug by hand by the mid 1830s. These were not dug by slaves. Most of the canals, in fact, were not in slave states. They were built largely by Irish immigrants and German immigrants who used a shovel, a pickaxe, and they would use an early form of dynamite or blasting powder when there was a rocky area. Here we have a photo of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, which goes from Washington, D.C. up to Cumberland, Maryland, and connects there with the National Road Network. And this canal was dug entirely by hand, and you can go and see it today. In fact, you can take a tourism boat up and down it. It's over 180 miles long, and the way it worked was you can see on the side is a path. This is called the towpath. The boat obviously had no motor because it didn't have motors then, nor did it use sails, but the boat was pulled by horses or mules, which were on the towpath and connected by a rope to the barge. And in that manner, the barge could go in both directions on the canal. There was a slight current heading towards the ocean, but the canal was built at a very slight slope. This is the next slide shows you a photo of the very same canal. This photo was taken a few years ago, and this is an area about 20 miles from Washington, D.C. And as you can see, they have tourism barges now, so you can go there, go on the barge, and you have people dressed up in the period dress, and they'll play the banjo and explain how the system works. On the left side here, you have the towpath, of which I have bicycled or hiked many, many miles, and I wasn't ambitious enough, but they do have every year a 180-mile bicycle race along that towpath. It's quite difficult on a bicycle because it's not asphalt or concrete. It's like gravel, and so even with a mountain bike, the tire sticks in somewhat. But as you can see, this canal is still full of water. It's not used commercially, but it's preserved as part of the National Historic Trust. Another significant canal, the Erie Canal in northern New York, and this flows some 360 miles from the Great Lakes to the Hudson River. We have a map on the next slide to show exactly where it is. So this is the Erie Canal, and again, you can see the Hudson River, which goes north from New York City and to Albany, which is the capital, of course, of New York State. And then so a large boat could go up there. A boat from Europe could actually go up there. And then the products would be transferred to the barges, which go along the Red Line, which is the Erie Canal, which goes over 300 miles to Buffalo, New York, where the products, the manufactured goods from Europe, could go on the Great Lakes and go down to the major cities in the Midwest. In the other direction, farm products and lumber would be taken along the canal and put on boats and then go down to New York City, and either consumed in New York City or exported to Europe or the Caribbean or whatever. I note the Erie Canal is still in use today by commercial vehicles to move coal, steel, very heavy vessels from the Great Lakes to New York City. This is a drawing from the 19th century of the canals in operation. You can see on the left the two horses with a rope connected to the canals pulling them through. Well, it's fairly simple to build a canal where the land is flat, but obviously the land is not entirely flat, and in fact there's always a small gradient with the water flowing with a mild current in the canal. But also the canals often had to go through very hilly areas with different water levels, and they didn't want the canal to be a fast-moving waterway. So they came up with a very, very ingenious system, which is still in use today, and these are called locks. Now this is a a drawing of a lock, and you can see it and I'll explain in a minute how it works. This is a mechanism to move the canal boats from a lower to a higher level or vice versa. So here you can see in the foreground of this drawing, you can see the barges waiting for their turn to enter the lock system and be elevated. Here we see a photograph which is in Washington, D.C. And again, this is the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. And this is in a very touristy area, Washington, D.C., and it's still in operation for tourist boats. And you can see it's a very simple mechanism with two gates, one at each side, which can be opened and closed quite easily by one single person pushing them. And you can see in this photograph, the water at the top of the photograph in the background is significantly higher than the water at the bottom. And the way it works is, let's say in this one, we want to go from the lower water to the upper water level. We enter from the front of the photograph with our barge, our vessel, being pulled by horses. It goes up, then they close the doors behind us. Then they open a valve to let water in from the higher water. It just falls through gravity, of course, no mechanisms here, or pumps. And then once the water the gates are closed, and then once the water within the gate lock system is the same level, there's no pressure on the upper gates. You can easily open those gates with one hand. In fact, I've done it. It's surprisingly easy. And then you go on your merry way. And it's just the reverse coming back. I encourage you to look at the YouTube video, which I've posted in the module. It's a 2-minute video, and it shows graphically how these locks work to take vessels from one level to another. We can see locks through mountains. So by hand, they dug a large hole there in the middle of a mountain, and they have the canal in the center, and you can see the towpath on it. And here we have a lock system, and next to each lock there was a house, because a family would live there, and their job was whenever a boat came and needed to pass through the lock system, the family there would operate the lock, and they'd be paid a little money for the service. And the family would also sell food and other essential supplies for the families that were living on the barges going up and down all year. Now, as I mentioned, these locks are still in use, and one place you can see them and made a significant difference was the Panama Canal. Now, the Panama Canal was built after this course ends, but you can see throughout this period of this course, if you wanted to travel by boat from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States or vice versa, the only way to do it was travel around South America, which is 21,000 kilometers. And then when the Panama Canal was built across Central America just before World War I, you can see it cut the distance by over 1/2. And this is just a simple map to show you the geography of the Panama Canal. They took a very narrow part of Central America, and they wanted to dig as little as possible, so they found an area with some natural lakes, or they created artificial lakes, and therefore they still had to cut through many, many miles of rock, and they built the canal. And as you'll see in the next course, the construction of the Panama Canal was significant from economic and military terms. It also was an engineering feat, and there were great medical advances made because, first of all, doctors had to come up with a prevention for yellow fever because the French had originally tried to build the canal, and so many thousands of their workers had died of yellow fever they had given up. And here we see a photograph of the Panama Canal today. You can see very large cruise ships going through, and also vessels can go in both directions. Now on the rivers, as we saw previously, the Mississippi River was great if you wanted to go from north to south in that region of the country, and it had a strong current, so you would build a boat and essentially just float down to New Orleans. But there was no way to get upriver because of the strong current. Well, that was conquered with the invention of the steam engine, and steamboats were constructed. They had a very shallow draft, which meant that the steamboat did not go very far underwater. The reason for that is the Mississippi River is not very deep in many places, and it's quite muddy, and particularly when the steamboat wants to go to the shore, to a dock, it can't have a deep draft, or it can't go down very far in the water. Here we see a drawing of one of the earliest steamboats, and all they simply did was put the motor on the side, and it turns a wheel called a paddle wheel. And the reason they use that instead of a propeller is a propeller is underwater and can get easily covered by the weeds and whatnot on the Mississippi River. And at this time you see that black smoke coming out. Most of us now say, ugh, pollution. Well, they had the opposite reaction then. People were very proud of the fact that they were using an engine, that they were burning wood or coal, and the general feeling was the more smoke, the better. The smoke is a sign of progress. Here we see a much more elegant steamboat, much larger. This was a passenger vessel, which would also carry mail and some cargo. And here you can see the very, very large steam wheel, which is powering the vessel. You also see two smokestacks, appropriately called smokestacks. You can see the smoke coming out. And again, people were very proud of seeing so much smoke coming out. It was a sign of industrial progress. The same thing for factories. Cities were very, very proud of having factories with lots of smoke coming out. And in some of the cities, once they started using steam engines, the air was totally polluted. People were coughing all the time, but people thought that was the price of progress, and that was wonderful. And here we just have an early photograph of steamships along the Mississippi River at a time when they were providing the main source of transportation for food and people. And if you've ever read Mark Twain's books, you know Mark Twain started off, or the author, Samuel Clemens, actually worked on steamboats along the Mississippi River. And for that reason, in Samuel Clemens, the Mark Twain novels, you have many, many stories centering around steamboats. Now, for international transportation, there was a need for faster sailboats, and that need was largely because Americans were consuming much tea, and the tea was imported from China, which obviously is a long way away, and they wanted to have faster boats to bring the tea faster so it wouldn't lose as much flavor. So in the 1840s, in New England, they developed a new type of sailboat called the clipper ship, which sailed twice as fast as the older merchant ships, and it essentially had taller masts and larger sails. Here we have a drawing of one of these vessels under construction, and New England, both in colonial times and at this time, remained a center of shipbuilding. The ships were built of wood. New England had many, many forests, and New England had fine trees for ships because it was strong wood. One fascinating example of global commerce at this time, and not particularly well known, was the fact that a businessman in Boston, Massachusetts, was looking for a product to export. Well, he didn't have a factory, but he thought, well, one thing New England has a lot of was ice because of the very cold winters. The lakes were frozen over, and he saw a need in many countries to have ice in warm regions of the world. People wanted ice to put in their drinks, to crush up and make something akin to ice cream. And he had read how in Rome, under the emperors, they had ice in the summer because the ice was harvested from mountains about 50 miles away in the winter, brought to Rome and stored underground, and it lasted all summer, even though, of course, there was some melting. So he came up with a scheme of exporting ice around the world, and he sent this rice, as you can see on the next slide. Move there. He sent this ice as far away as China, India, Australia. You can see in this maps the Gulf Coast to the Houston area, to the Caribbean, and throughout South America. And as he developed his business, ice no longer became a luxury for only the very wealthy. In fact, it is said in India that not just the wealthy, but even the middle class could purchase ice that had been exported all the way from Boston, Massachusetts. If you visit any old plantation homes in the southern part of the United States, and there's one very near to where we are here in Fort Bend County, at the Fort Bend County Museum in Rosenberg. They have a house built there in the 19th century, and right in front of it there is an underground ice house, and you can go down the stairs and you can see this, and it was lined with wood, and then they put sawdust, and the ice would come up from the port of Galveston, and slaves would put the ice in the ice house where it would easily last all summer. And in addition to using the ice for drinking, the owners of the house on hot days, which we have a lot of in Houston, as we all know, they would sometimes just go down and sit in a chair in the ice house where it was nice and cool. Here you can see how they harvested the ice. They had horses pull a plow, an iron plow, and they would have the horse pull it maybe 10 or 15 times along the same line, so it would cut through the ice, which maybe was a foot and a half deep, and then the horse would go in the opposite direction to cut blocks of ice. Those blocks of ice were floated down the river to a warehouse, and then they were put on vessels. Also at this time, you had many, many people in the United States, in fact, virtually everyone except the very poor, would have ice boxes because they didn't have electric refrigerators yet. So people would have it. You can think of it today as like a beverage cooler, but in their kitchen, a piece of furniture, and several times a week, a horse and wagon like this would come to your front door. You see the man on the left there is holding a big block of ice. He'd take that in, put it in the ice compartment of your ice box, and there were some holes, and on the other side you would keep milk, butter, other products that needed to be cool. It was very effective as long as you could get ice, usually about twice a week, and the area where the ice was well insulated to prevent it from melting quickly. I remember as a young child, my grandmother still called the refrigerator the ice box, and even though I think she grew up with refrigerators, but maybe her parents called it the ice box. And that's where you get the expression ice box. And so just thinking ahead, you can think how revolutionary it was around 1920 to have an electric refrigerator and not have to go through the expense and hassle of having ice delivered. Here we have a drawing of slaves unloading the blocks of ice in Cuba, and the blocks of ice would be put in an underground ice house where there would be relatively little melting, and so the wealthier people could have nice ice drinks all summer. I might mention on the special ice ships that the man in Boston, Massachusetts developed. He took regular ships and then he put special insulation on the side, which was largely made of sawdust and straw, and then covered with wood. And when he would ship ice all the way from Boston to India, a voyage of months and months and months, only about 10% of the ice would melt. I mean, that's incredible. 10% of the ice would melt in a several-month voyage. Now, in addition to roads and canals and the natural rivers that were there, the railroad became a major means of transportation, both for people and products. And the early railroads often just went, across a farm or something, but gradually they became a significant factor. And then you can see on this map, in green, the railroads, and this is around 1850. They don't go west yet beyond the Mississippi, and in fact, a transcontinental railroad to California, to the coast of California, was not completed until 1869, a few years after the Civil War. But here you can see, particularly in the Midwest area, which is becoming heavily industrialized and also has a lot of very wealthy agricultural holdings, and in New England, there's quite a network of railroads. The railroads took a while to be adopted. There were many, many early failures, many, many accidents. They didn't have modern safety brakes, and often they had explosions in which the passengers and all the employees were killed. Nor was the size of the track, the width of the track, standardized at first, which was a problem if you shipped products on one train and then it'd have to be unpacked and put on another train because the train car could not fit on the other company's tracks. Here you have a famous horse race. Tom Thumb was the name of this early steam engine, and you have the inventor there. And people said, oh, that's not very fast. So he challenged a horse to a race. So this was an 11-mile race. So the horse is also pulling a wagon full of people on a railroad track. And the horse actually won the race because the Tom Thumb railroad engine broke down. But it helped convince a skeptical public that it might work. Again, people at the time would see that black smoke coming out, and that was a sign of progress. That was a sign of humans conquering nature. And what you see there on the train is steam trains use steam, obviously, and that's produced by boiling water. So that container is full of boiling water and steam, and occasionally they would break, and when that broke, you would have hot metal fly out and steaming water come and either kill or badly burn people. Initially, the railroad's fastest expansion was in the southern part of the United States, and plantations would use it to haul people and cotton, from one side of a plantation to the port or whatever. Now, in terms of communication, there were several significant advances. One, which was the telegraph, which was developed in the 1840s and quickly spread, and the telegraph wires were put up next to train tracks and roads, so it would be easy to put the posts up, put the telegraph wires up, and if there was a problem, then it would be easy to go out and find where there was a problem with the telegraph cable. And this is the first time in history that information travels faster than a person or animal could run or a ship could sail across the ocean. So a tremendous, tremendous impact, not only in people's personal lives to hear news from loved ones, but also a major impact in economic terms, because now people in business, whether they're farmers or in industry, could know the price of products in other markets. They were no longer dependent on just selling their product to the first person who offered them the price. Another development was the post office. And this was absolutely crucial for transmitting not only personal letters, but newspapers. And newspapers were essential to having an informed public in the day and age before, obviously, internet, television, radio. And foreign visitors to the United States would be shocked that they go into a relatively poor farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, and that farmhouse would have a Bible and the local newspaper. In the United States, most white people were literate and could read basic newspapers. Also, the post office carried small packages or parcels, very, very crucial, particularly for farmers, to order supplies. And in fact, if you went to a typical farmhouse, the farmer and his family would order clothes, farm implements, and essential items, even a stove for their house, from Sears, Roebuck and Company. And they would go to the local telegraph office where they would have a Sears catalog, which is a several thousand-page book, and they would fill out an order blank. The telegraph operator would telegraph the order. Then a few days later, the products would be delivered there at the telegraph station, which was at the train station. It's also important to notice that newspapers became more and more accessible, because now you don't have a man physically, pushing the plate down with ink on each page to print a page, but rather you have rotary printers that are operated by steam. So this is where we are in 1850. We have west of the Mississippi an increasingly large and integrated system of transportation, road, railroad, and canal. And you can see we have roads going out west. We don't have the railroad yet going out to California, but the country is becoming integrated. And what this meant was you had much, much more of a national market. Unlike in Europe, the railroads were privately run and operated. However, the federal government did play a crucial role in developing the railroads. The national government provided land for railroads as well as canals. And so what happened is the federal government would say to a railroad company, if you promise to build a railroad, and you have to sign a contract that you will do so from point A to point B, and if that railroad is going through federal land, we will give you that land free, not only for the railroad track, but 20 or 30 miles on each side. Now, for the railroad, they got the land. They could also then sell the land to farmers who wanted to have a farm there. The farmers would not have any interest unless there was a railroad there, because they had no way to get their farm products to market or to travel themselves. And so it was a mutually advantageous system. The federal government also bought stock in various railroads as well as canals and toll roads or turnpikes. At this time, there's also a significant amount of new technologies which helped propel this first of the two industrial revolutions. And this greatly increased productivity. And productivity, of course, is defined as the amount of output per worker. And each year, there were around 30,000 new patents being issued. You had the early sewing machines. You had vulcanized rubber, which is a stronger form of rubber. Many, many types of machines used in factories to produce other products, from textile machines to others. One of the most significant new technologies was the cotton gin. The word gin is just a shortened form of engine. What the cotton gin did was it was a series of, it was like a comb in effect. Like you use your comb in your hair, that's a simplification, but it would go through the cotton, the harvested cotton, and remove the seeds. This greatly reduced the labor involved in producing cotton. Previously, relatively little cotton was grown in the southern states because you'd have to have many more slaves sitting on the ground, going through the cotton and taking out the seeds. And so it wasn't worth it to produce cotton. However, with the cotton gin, it became very, very easy with a very simple and inexpensive machine to remove the seeds. And this greatly increased the demand for slaves, particularly, slaves to work in the fields to grow that cotton, because there was an almost insatiable demand for cotton. The cotton industry, the textiles in both Britain and the northern part of the United States. Here we have a drawing of several slave women with an early cotton gin. So you can see in this drawing, the cotton comes down and the little dots are there to represent the seeds, which are very difficult to take out by hand. But down below this machine, you have some horses turning a wheel which turns this machine, which takes out the cotton, the seeds. So these two women and a couple horses can do the work maybe of 500 or 600 people beforehand. Now we can see in a few maps the great extent of cotton cultivation thanks to the cotton gin. On these maps you'll see, and this is the key, cotton is in blue, tobacco is in dark green, sugar is in a darker green, and rice is in a reddish color. So here we see in 1860, just as the Civil War starts, the plantation economies in the South. That light blue that runs all the way across the South is the so-called Cotton Belt. This is extensive cotton cultivation, and this is where most of the slaves are employed. And in fact, cotton becomes the major export of the entire United States. And you can see where Houston is. There was extensive cotton plantation. Right here in Katy, Houston, and a little north. And of course, there's nothing in West Texas because the land is too dry to use without irrigation. You can also see south of where we are, near Galveston, Lake Jackson area, there was sugar. Just like you can see in Louisiana there was extensive sugar. Over in Georgia, South Carolina, the area along the coast is indigo, rice, and some indigo. And then in the north of that, in the slave states, in the northern part of the slave belt, you have tobacco. Now this was, of course, accompanied by a major population shift in the South. Here you can see Southern population, and this is slave population between 1820 and 1860. So the red areas, as you can see on this map in the legend, have a high concentration of slaves. Over half the population in a county consisted of slaves, and you can see it quite dramatically moving out all the way along the so-called lower South, the Mississippi River, and the area where we are today in Texas, which of course in 1820 was still part of Spain, then Mexico, and then, as we'll see later, Texas becomes independent. You can see the great reliance on slaves. So cotton was called King Cotton because of its role in the economy. It greatly increased the demand for slaves to work out in the fields and cultivate it. Now, if you were a slave owner, you didn't want your slaves growing the food they were going to eat or have the slave women making blankets and things. You'd get them all out in the fields. They could make so much money growing cotton. You could sell that cotton and buy lots of food and blankets. The illegal importation of slaves, as we saw before, ended in 1808, but there continued to be much smuggling, and smuggling increased now because slaves were worth much more because of cotton. The traditional image many of us have of the South was not really true. The facts are less than 1/3 of Southern whites owned slaves, so the vast majority didn't own any slaves. Most of the slave owners had small farms with just 1, 2, or 3 slaves. And in fact, the majority of Southern whites who were farmers, and most were farmers, were yeoman farmers, sort of by themselves and their families. Here we have a depiction of a small slaveholder. You can see a few slaves in the background there. The whites are out in the fields doing the work. Obviously, they leave the heavy work for the slaves, but most slave owners had just a couple slaves like this. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, you have large plantations. George Washington's plantation in Virginia was an early example of this. And here you see the slave housing. And, so some large plantations did have hundreds and hundreds of slaves. And as for the blacks who were not slaves, most of them worked for whites, often on a farm or in town in a store or whatnot. Now let's turn from the South and King Cotton to the North, particularly the Northeast, where you started the so-called American system of manufacturing. This was a shift to factories from the home because previously the extent of when there was manufacturing was the so-called putting out system. This would be where often families would work together to sew shirts or other clothing. The person they worked for would go by with a wagon, a cart, and leave a lot of cloth with instructions on how to make the shirts. And at the end of the week would pick up the shirts. So it was like putting out the labor in the homes. Now it was felt to be much more efficient, and it was more efficient in economic terms to bring the workers to a building to do the work so they could all be together, with each worker doing 1 or 2 tasks. So you wouldn't have someone make the entire shirt. You'd have someone who, for instance, was in charge of sewing on the buttons. Someone else would put on the collar, etc., etc. And this became specialization. The workers required fewer skills because it didn't have to make, for instance, a whole shirt or the entire shoe. They would just do 1 or 2 tasks. And this system was mentioned in Adam Smith's famous book, The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. And he used in his book the example of a pin factory and said it's much, much more productive for a group of workers to each do 1 simple or 2 simple tasks in the manufacturing of a pin. And he had shown in experiments that a group of workers with specialized skills could produce many, many more pins per day than the same number of workers who each produced every element of a pin. Another thing we started seeing here now are interchangeable parts, where the parts, for instance, in a gun are the same. They have a box, and if you're making a rifle, all the triggers are the same, all the barrels are the same. Previously, you had one highly skilled craftsman, a gunsmith, make the entire gun, everything from taking the wood, carving the wood to make the wooden part of a rifle, the stock of a rifle, making the barrel, making everything. The problem was if that gun broke, if the Army had those guns and they broke, they couldn't repair them in the field. They couldn't have a box of spare triggers or spare parts because each piece was individually made to fit in the gun. So the gun had to be shipped back. So with the interchangeable parts, it was much easier to repair guns, whatever it turned out to be, bicycles later, etc. And it also meant it was much easier to manufacture them because, for instance, for a gun, you could have 20 people standing there in the factory, and they just had boxes in front of them of the different parts of the gun, and they would do whatever they needed to do. This is in Massachusetts. The power here comes from either the river, turning machines, or you can see on the left early steam machines. And again, people who lived in this city were very proud to see all the smoke coming out of the chimney to show how scientifically advanced they were. Now the workers are focused on assembly, putting things together. However, this is not yet the assembly line, which doesn't occur till after the Civil War, where you have the famous example, for instance, of Henry Ford's assembly line to assemble cars. But you do have workers just doing a few tasks. So you don't have, the formal assembly line. The result here is the guild system, which had been used for centuries and centuries in Europe, disappeared. You no longer had a highly skilled craftsman who spent his life making guns, could make every element. Now you have relatively unskilled workers. You can bring someone in off the street, show them in a morning what to do, and their job was just to put a few parts together. Well, this led to lower wages because it was easy to do this. The workers, weren't particularly skilled. They couldn't demand higher wages. Here we have a women in an early factory, and they're working in a textile factory where cloth is being produced. You can see at the top there's a leather belt being turned by a water wheel or a steam engine, and it's powering the factory. So you have a number of women here doing the work that previously would have taken thousands of workers to do, thanks to machines. Now, while productivity was good, the downside was the unskilled workers, many of whom were immigrants in the early factories, or people from the farms who wanted the attraction of city life, were not paid very much. And this is a depiction of a family with the worker either passed out from lack of food or drink, and the conditions for these low-skilled workers were very low. If they protested, they wanted higher wages, they would simply generally be fired. This is before the labor movement started, labor unions started, which you'll see in the next course after after the Civil War. And the workers had no real skills. They didn't need them for their job, and so if they individually complained, they were just shown the door, and there were lots of other people to replace them. Now, immigration at this period, until the Civil War, is largely from Germany and Ireland or Great Britain. Here we can see a map, and I'm sorry, some of this is cut off, but the shading represents the percentage of immigrants in the total population. So the darkest green is 20% or more of the population in those states in 1850 was consisted of immigrants. So you have New York, and you have Wisconsin and what was then known as the Minnesota Territory. These were immigrants largely from Germany and Scandinavia. Or you have California, which of course, here they're looking at the total population minus the Indians. And you had the gold rush in 1849, which took many, many people there. So and many, many people from Europe as well as Asia went there. Then you can see the Midwest states, the lighter shade of green. It's 10 to 20% of the total population were immigrants. Just by way of comparison, in the United States today, approximately 11% of the total population of the United States today consists of people who were not born in the United States. And that percentage obviously varies significantly from region to region and city to city. Well, the immigration provided this labor force that was really needed. And many of them were fairly low skilled, worked in factories. And this created an entirely new social class of what we still call today blue collar workers. These are people who worked in factories, called blue collar because often they'd wear a blue shirt so it wouldn't get oil stains on it, or the oil stains wouldn't be as visible. Then you also have a new middle class of workers with more skills. These are the clerks, the people who work in the offices of the factories. They started off largely male, and we'll see the next course how they then became largely female. Managers, you had to have someone manage the purchase of the products that were used in the manufacturing process, the machines. People had to manage the payment of the workers, and then obviously the sales force. And then you have many, many more female teachers. These classes of people were called, and still are, white collar because they prided themselves they could work in a white shirt and not get oil and dirt on it because they weren't working in a factory. It's also interesting to see young people are marrying later now because they have more economic opportunities. And also, they start having smaller families because, particularly living in the city, it became much more expensive to have larger families. And so they often purposely had fewer children. Okay, thank you very much.